Putin tried to create a narrative about an inevitable Russian victory in Ukraine. Russia would steamroll Ukraine's defenses in 2026, Putin shouted from the rooftops. Russia's leader wanted to project strength, but 2026 has revealed that his grand proclamations were a sign of desperation. Something has broken on Russia's front lines, and the inevitable 2026 victory isn't coming. Ukraine is now winning the war, and experts have explained why. It all comes down to advances on the battlefield. Russia is making far fewer of them, and Ukraine is building momentum. On the Russian side, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, the experts who have the numbers reveal just how much of a lie Putin's claims of a 2026 victory have turned out to be. The reality for Russia is that the last 6 months have seen its gains in Ukraine slow down substantially as Ukraine mounted a combination of devastating defense and overwhelming offense to take a fight that Putin claimed was practically won right back to Russia. The ISW looks at the period between October 2025 and March 2026 in its March 31st assessment of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Amidst the loss of Starlink access and the Kremlin's efforts to throttle Telegram, both of which have caused havoc on the front line, the gains made by Putin's forces have slowed. The 6 months in question saw Russia take 1,929.69 square kilometers, or about 745 square miles of Ukrainian territory. That amounts to an average gain of just over 124 square miles per month, or as the ISW puts it, 10.66 square kilometers, or a little over 4.1 square miles per day. What's the problem, you might wonder? These figures still show that Russia is pushing forward. You're right, they do. But remember the narrative that Putin has been trying to build. 2026 is to be the year that Ukraine's defenses finally crumble. However, when we compare these gains to what Russia achieved a year earlier, we start to see the holes in that particular narrative. The ISW's experts compared the figures for the 6 months into March 2026 with the equivalent period between October 2024 and March 2025. What they found is that Russia's forces managed to seize 2,716.57 square kilometers, or almost 1,049 square miles of Ukraine during that period. That amounts to close to 175 square miles per month, which is 14.9 square kilometers or 5.75 square miles per day. Are you starting to see a problem here? Russia is supposed to be on the verge of breaking Ukraine, but its battlefield gains are telling a very different story. What we really see here is the last 6 months have been a failure of epic proportions for Russia. It has taken 300 square miles less between October 2025 and March 2026 than it did during the same period between October 2024 and March 2025. This even though Russia is launching more long-range drones at Ukraine than it ever has before, which included a March 24th assault that involved almost 1,000 drones. These types of attacks were ramped up during the winter as Russia attempted to pressure Ukraine's forces on the ground by terrorizing the country's citizens with the loss of electricity and heating. None of these strategies have worked. Far from being finally defeated by Russia's relentless attacks, Ukraine is not only standing firm, but it's creating problems behind the slower Russian advances that will leave Putin scratching his head. We'll get to those problems soon, but right now it's all adding up to a turning point in the Ukraine war. And to make it all even worse for Russia, March has brought with it the beginning of the spring offensive that is supposed to end it all for Ukraine. And still, the gains are far lower than they were just a year ago. We can see how hard Russia is trying to make it appear as though it's actually pushing in the numbers once again. Both the Kyiv Independent and RBC Ukraine have reported on Russia ramping up the number of its assaults in March. The former reported on March 23rd, the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Alexander Syrskyi, has confirmed that Russia's ground forces launched 600 assaults in the 4 days leading up to the article's publication. That didn't go well for Russia. Those 600 assaults were stifled as well as we've seen Ukraine manage in the 6-month period that the ISW covers, and Russia's losses were enormous. Putin committed tens of thousands of troops to these attacks, and the 4 days in question saw it suffer 6,090 casualties, Syrskyi says. Taking the entire week up to March 23rd into account, Russia suffered 8,710 infantry losses for practically no gains. Thanks to the professional and coordinated actions of Ukrainian troops, the enemy's offensive operations have been halted on several fronts, Syrskyi declared at the time. RBC Ukraine's report highlights how unrealistic Russia's goals have become as its offensives are stalled and it makes fewer gains. The outlet says that the Donetsk fortress belt, which includes the key cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, is supposed to be in the Kremlin's sights. To get to those cities, Russia has to occupy another part of the fortress belt, Konstantinivka. Putin has set a deadline of April 25th for Russia's forces to get that particular job done, and he says that all of Donetsk should fall into Russia's hands by 2026. These are absolutely ludicrous demands. It took 21 months for Russia to achieve any sort of breakthrough in the Donetsk city of Pokrovsk, and then several more months afterward to get to the point where they could legitimately claim to have taken the city. Pokrovsk is smaller than many of the major cities in the fortress belt, yet Putin seems to think that the belt will fall in the next 9 months. How? Russia is moving forward at a slower pace than it was a year ago, yet Putin somehow thinks that things are going to magically speed up, even as his army is losing more soldiers than at any other point in 2026. If there's any semblance of logic here, then we can't find it. What we see are desperate demands from a Russian president who knows that the supposedly inevitable collapse of Ukraine is far from the reality that's being showcased on the battlefield. The gains are far too slow for the demands. They're definitely too slow for the deadlines that Putin has set for his forces. As the ISW puts it, battlefield realities as of late March 2026 continue to show that significant Russian battlefield gains, let alone total victory, are not imminent nor inevitable. But this is where the real problem lies for Putin. As his forces have been slowed to a crawl all across Ukraine, they're also having to deal with the fact that they have been losing territory in a key part of the battlefield. In Ukraine's south, where Russia had spent much of the latter part of 2025 taking territory, with the goal of creating a buffer zone to protect its main offensive in Donetsk in 2026, Russia has been losing ground. On March 31st, Syrskyi revealed that Ukraine's successful southern offensive has disrupted Russia's plans for the spring. We're seeing that right now in the slow gains and the massive losses. Ukraine has also managed to liberate 480 square kilometers, or about 185 square miles of territory, in the Oleksandrivka sector so far, and more may be coming. What we're seeing here is more Russian losses to add to those that Russia has already experienced in recent months. These latest gains exceed the indicators seen during the Dobropilia counteroffensive, which UNN reports saw Ukraine take back about 430 square kilometers, or about 166 square miles of territory from Russia. And in Kupiansk, which Russia was claiming to have captured toward the end of 2025, there has been a complete turnaround that adds up to at least another 183 square kilometers, or 70.65 square miles of territory liberated. This is a lethal combination for Russia. It's gaining less ground than it was a year ago, and that problem is being compounded by the fact that Ukraine is liberating territory, not just any territory either. These are key settlements and patches of land that Ukraine has taken back, territory that Russia expended huge amounts of time and manpower to occupy in the first place. What this means is that Russia now has to waste even more of its resources in vain attempts to recapture territory that it thought it safely held. More reserves will be sent from the main Eastern Front by Putin, which slows down the already faltering offensives there, which means even less territory taken. There is now a cycle of Russian failure in place, as Putin's forces are stretched while Ukraine continues to build momentum on the battlefield. This is what Ukraine's inevitable collapse looks like, Putin. If it is, Ukraine will want a lot more of the same. Let's come back to those ambitious Kremlin goals that we mentioned. Is there any chance of them being achieved? The ISW's experts say no. Russia has been forced to turn to covert mobilization efforts just to sustain the slower rate of advance that we're seeing, as more of its soldiers are churned up by Ukraine's defenses. In Ryazan, a decree was signed on March 20th that requires businesses with between 150 and 500 employees to choose between 2 and 5 of their employees to sign contracts with the Russian military. That is insanity and desperation colluding to force soldiers into a supposedly volunteer army. And it's happening because Putin knows that Russia can't come close to hitting the targets that he has set for its soldiers. How could it? The Kremlin is forcing people out of the workplace to fight, which is as sure an indicator as any that the stream of volunteers that has allowed Russia to get this far in Ukraine is drying. We see the collapse in Russia's gains happening in real time. The question is, how did all of this happen? That is exactly what we're going to cover next. But before we do, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. We bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. If you want to stay ahead of the curve, make sure you subscribe to the channel. So what happened to cause Russia's slowdown? Ukraine's counterattack, which we've already discussed, has played a huge role. It's forced Russia to divert troops to retake territory that it thought it held, and that has naturally had an impact elsewhere on the front. Elite Russian airborne and naval infantry were sent south early in March to stop Ukraine's advance. They've clearly failed. For its part, Ukraine has been conducting counterattacks along areas of the front lines where Russia's troops are at their weakest. This forces yet more shuffling in the Russian ranks as military commanders have to divert troops to wherever the latest Ukrainian counter is happening. Those troops take time to arrive, which leads to more territory being liberated, and every reshuffle disrupts what Russia had planned across the entire front line. Again, it's a cycle. And as long as Ukraine keeps it up, Russia doesn't have any real answers for it. However, there is more to this shift of momentum in Ukraine's favor than just the counteroffensive. Ukraine's defensive evolution has also just played a massive part in what we're seeing on the battlefield now. And we don't mean the increase in FPV drones in the kill zones that were already tearing through Putin's forces. Those zones have tripled in size across the front line because Ukraine has developed and is now utilizing mid-range drones to wreck Russia's rear in the occupied territories. The ISW covered this in a March 15th X post where it noted that Ukrainian forces are intensifying their mid-range strike campaign, increasing their ability to contest Russian missile strikes, degrade Russian air defenses, and disrupt offensive operations ahead of an expected Russian spring-summer 2026 offensive. Other outlets, including Pravda and the Kyiv Independent, have reported that Ukraine taking out Russian air defenses has become a key pattern in 2026. The mid-range drones can travel almost 3 times the distance of weapons like the HIMARS rockets, which Ukraine has used to attack Russian targets in the occupied territories in the past. Those rockets are now being joined by drones that shatter Russian air defenses, which then create safe aerial corridors Ukraine can exploit to use the same drones to destroy troop gatherings, command and control posts, drone operation headquarters, and anything else that Russia has behind the lines that it uses to support its forces on the front. This is a systematic degradation of the fighting force that Putin has amassed, and it's slowing Russia down. It has to. The logic here is very simple. If one of Ukraine's middle-range drones hits a Russian ammunition stockpile, that ammo can't be given to the soldiers tasked with assaulting positions on the front. What happens next? Those soldiers with no ammo are still ordered to advance, and they get picked apart by Ukraine's drones before they get close to achieving any sort of forward momentum. As Russia's air defense web inside Ukraine crumbles, these attacks on the near rear will become more intense, and they're being accompanied by the deep strikes into Russian territory that we've seen for well over a year, and that serve the same purpose of crippling Russia's military from the inside as the mid-range drones. Ukraine has offered the perfect example in March with a relentless assault against Russia's Baltic Sea ports. Attacks against those ports have taken 40% of Russia's crude oil export capacity offline, the Kyiv Post reported on April 1st. That means Russia isn't able to sell oil and fuel at a time when prices are at the highest they've been since the COVID era due to Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Fewer sales means less cash coming into Russia for the Kremlin's attacks. And if Putin isn't getting that oil revenue, he can't spend money on building more equipment and hiring the soldiers that Russia needs to make the gains in Ukraine. You can see how all of this has added up to a nightmare scenario for Russia. Ukraine has built battlefield momentum by carefully prioritizing its targets, all as Russia's approach hasn't evolved from the throw cannon fodder at Ukraine strategy that Putin has employed since the beginning of his invasion. Clever counterattacks in Ukraine's south have disrupted Russia's offensive in the east. Mid-range drones are taking out military nodes in the east, causing even more disruption. And in Russia itself, Ukraine is hitting oil along with other military targets, with attacks that see it throw constant spokes into the wheels of the Russian war machine. This is coordinated, calculated. It's Ukraine at its best, and it's making Putin very desperate to cling to the narrative that Russia's victory is inevitable. We've mentioned this desperation already, and we're starting to see obvious signs of it in the demands that Putin is making of Ukraine as Russia's leader pushes for a version of peace that his troops can't earn on the battlefield. On March 31st, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky revealed that Russia has demanded that Ukraine withdraw from the entire Donbas region within the next 2 months. So the end of May then. Uncoincidentally, the Donbas is the eastern region that is the focus of Russia's spring offensive, the home of the fortress belt, and the place where Russia's gains have been slowing down. A day after this news broke, Kyiv Independent reported that Putin took things a step further. April 1st saw Putin's favorite mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov claim, "As for the 2 months, that's not the point here. Zelensky must make a decision already today to withdraw Ukrainian troops beyond the administrative borders of the Donbas. This has been said repeatedly, and in theory, Zelensky should have made this decision yesterday. He needs to take responsibility and make this difficult decision." This is pressure from Putin being placed on Ukraine. But it's not the sort of pressure that's going to cause Ukraine to wilt. Kyiv has repeatedly said that it will not even consider ceding the Donbas as part of a peace agreement. Russia knows this, but it's making the latest set of demands now because it knows that the crawling pace of its advance over the last 6 months is nowhere near what it needs to be for it to achieve its target of capturing Donetsk, which would in turn mean the fall of the Donbass by the end of 2026. Again, this is Putin attempting to project power at a time when the momentum is in Ukraine's favor. Territory is being liberated in Ukraine's south, and Russia's spring offensive has gotten off to the worst start that it possibly could. There is no reason for Ukraine to acquiesce to these desperate demands. The president of the Kyiv School of Economics, Timofey Milovanov, revealed on March 31st that March 2026 is on track to be a record month for Russian losses, as the casualty toll looks set to exceed 30,000 again. On the front lines, Putin's desperation for a deal that hides how poorly Russia is doing is being reflected in the despair felt by the soldiers Russia is sending to the front line. A March 30th United 24 media report reveals that increasing numbers of Russian soldiers are taking their own lives rather than face the terrifying drone swarms that Ukraine has deployed in its kill zones. Ukraine's Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov say that Ukraine's forces are receiving so much video evidence of this spate of suicides that they can conclude that they are a daily occurrence among the Russian rank and file. Russia's soldiers typically take their own lives if they've been wounded or surrounded by Ukraine's drones, and it's because Russia's propaganda tells them that it's better to die immediately than to be taken prisoner by Ukraine. Lies upon lies. That's what the entire Ukraine invasion has been built on. Putin's soldiers are getting the dose of reality that their leader has been trying to hide from them. The spring offensive that was supposed to lead to the end of Ukraine is already failing. Thousands upon thousands of Russian soldiers are dying to Ukraine's defenses, and more are killing themselves before they have the chance to die. The Kremlin has set impossible targets that will not be achieved at the rate of advance that we've seen from Russia over the last 6 months. As for Ukraine, it's counterattacking. It's whittling away at Russia's rear. All signs point to a shift in momentum so enormous that Ukraine is coming closer to winning the war than Russia is to executing any of the plans that Putin has tried to put in motion. Russia's narrative has crumbled. Ukraine pushes forward as Russia slows down. And in the Baltic region, oil terminals are burning. We touched on Ukraine's long-range strikes in the Baltic region earlier, and they are devastating. Entire Russian ports have been wiped out by a repeated barrage of Ukrainian drones, and you can find out all about how Ukraine did it and why it's important if you watch our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show to keep up with our coverage of the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you, as always, for watching.